Next talk is about, or talk or panel, I would more say, is about exactly that topic. So it's called Beyond Privacy, the Human Impact of Drones. And I will welcome on the stage Jennifer Gibson, Aditi Gupta, Matthew Stender, and last but not least, Paul Schulte. Happy discussion.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Aditi Gupta. I work for Global Partners Digital in London, where we work focus on human rights in the digital context. To kick things off today, for this session, Beyond Privacy, the Human Impact of Drones, I wanted to first ask the audience, what does the word drone mean to you? You can just shout out anything. Anyone, just a word or a phrase? Bombs? Anyone else? Surveillance? What was that? Murder? Anything not? Flying robots? Pizza. All right, well, the sort of spectrum of pizza and bombs, you can see that drones mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones as they're commonly known, are used for a wide variety of purposes, from supporting conservation projects like the monitoring of poachers in Africa, to Amazon deliveries, to just being the latest sort of gadget present and making someone's day on their birthday. So we could talk about drones all day, and believe me, I'm sure we'd have a lot to talk about. But for the purposes of this session, I'd like to narrow down our focus on looking at drones purely in the security sphere. So the use of drones by governments to protect citizens in military operations abroad and policing at home. So we decided to focus on this aspect of drone use as debates around this particular form of use are particularly ferocious, with different sides emphasizing different impacts of how this technology is used, and in so doing with creating a whole new vocabulary of not only seeing what this technology is, but changing how we think about security, about warfare, about our rights, and about human lives at home and abroad. Here in the West, the public imagination tends to categorize drones and concurrently mass surveillance, primarily concerning privacy, due to the potentially harmful effects of being watched and monitored, and the impacting on the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly as well. However, on the other side of the world, in places like Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, drones are seen as primarily as deadly weapons, with surveillance serving as a means to create a metric that signs your death warrant. With drones seemingly here to stay, this panel aims to go beyond drones' effect on the right to privacy and look at the impact felt on the ground, examining the arguments for and against their use, sharing the experience of people who already live under them, looking at the precedents that are being set and the safeguards that we need to set. To do this, the discussion will be set around 3 questions. So where does the use of drones fit into the bigger picture of global security policy? What impact do military and policing drones have? And then what comes next? So we have our wonderful speakers. Paul Schulte is a non-resident senior associate in the Carnegie Endowment's Nuclear Policy Program and secular joint chair of the UK's Council on Christian Approaches to Defence and Disarmament. He holds fellowships and research roles at King's College, the Defence Academy of the UK, and the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's also held senior positions in the UK Ministry of Defence and has been chief speechwriter for 2 UK Defence Secretaries. Jennifer Gibson is a staff attorney at Reprieve, a legal action NGO in London, and she leads the drones work in Pakistan. Prior to joining Reprieve, Jennifer was at Stanford University, where she co-authored Living Under Drones, one of the most comprehensive accounts of the impact of drones in Pakistan to date. Both Jennifer and Paul also serve as commissioners on the University of Birmingham's Policy Commission on the security impacts of drones. Matthew Stender is a Berlin-based technology rights advocate, communication strategist, and creative director who focuses on digital censorship and the social impact of emerging technologies. He's currently a project strategist for onlinecensorship.org. So let's get started with our first question. Where does the use of drones fit into the bigger picture of global security policy? To create a visual starting point, I wanted us to watch 2 short clips. The first illustrates data on drone strikes in Pakistan to date, and the second one outlines some of the latest developments in policing drones. So if you'd like to give your attention. Should start. So as you can see, the bars on the top look at civilian counts, the gray is other, the high-value detainees. And you should see how the strikes increase as time goes on. We'll ask our speakers about what this signifies, but I'll leave it to them to have that debate. And then next we have...
It is now legal for North Dakota police to use drones to fire tasers and tear gas at people. Thanks to the work of a lobbyist who represents law enforcement and has ties with the drone industry, a bill was passed by the North Dakota State House that allows police to use armed drones. After obtaining a search warrant from a judge, North Dakota police can deploy drones to collect real-time intelligence video for criminal evidence. These police drones, however, are now also allowed to carry less than lethal weapons, like rubber bullets, pepper spray, tear gas, sound cannons, and tasers. But even less than lethal weapons can kill. According to The Guardian, at least 39 people have been killed by police tasers in 2015. With these weapons, police could potentially fire on criminal suspects from far away, much like how U.S. Air Force drone pilots bomb ISIS militants from 10,000 miles away. According to the FAA, 401 drone operations were undertaken by the Grand Forks County, North Dakota Sheriff's Department in the past 3 years. The department insists there were only 21 flights. Drones are seen as a positive thing in North Dakota, which, according to the Daily Beast, may be the reason why few people noticed when the House bill passed with a clause allowing them to be armed with less than lethal.
The last word is weapons. So if we go back to the question. So if maybe, Paul, if we start with you, where does the use of drones fit in the bigger picture of global security policy? Perhaps you can talk a bit about the role of drones and how their use has evolved.
Right. Well, we should understand that a drone is not a simple thing. It can have a number of meanings. It isn't a flying robot because it's remotely piloted so far. There may be artificial intelligence coming along, and we should worry about that and talk about it. Mostly remotely piloted vehicles have been used for what's called ISR, that's surveillance, targeting. So they don't kill people themselves, they communicate with other weapon systems or people who move in and engage and kill or capture. That's the vast majority of drone use. The maturation of technology, which has made drones such a big deal, has happened with the spread of the war on terror. Two very threatened, or nations that have felt themselves very threatened, Israel and America, have pioneered bringing together optronics and light materials and satellite bandwidth communications to create what we call easily the killer drone. And they have used them as a weapon of choice to go into areas which would otherwise be sanctuarized. Drones seem to be a lesser category of transgression. When they cross borders, people don't protest too much, states don't go to the UN about it. So we see a challenge to existing concepts of international law by the use of armed drones to kill terrorists in what would otherwise be sanctuaries. Mostly, though, for proper war, high-intensity war, drones are still not very useful because they can't defend themselves against ground defenses or enemy fighters. That may change as we get stealth drones coming along, which are being developed, but at the moment, drones in combat are used in low-intensity combat, asymmetrical warfare, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And that's really where we're at the moment. How it's going to go in the future, we can talk about later. But at the moment, these are niche weapons for particular kinds of campaigns which have captured the global imagination.
Thank you, Paul. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, or any things you differ on in opinion?
Yeah, let me take a slightly different tact from Paul here, because what I do is work with the civilians who are being killed by the drones. So I have a very different perspective on what they mean for security and what they potentially mean for the changing dynamics of how we fight war. That graphic you saw that Aditi put up is a region in Pakistan that is, and I don't have the German equivalent, so apologies to all the Germans in the room, but the equivalent of the size of Wales in the UK. We are talking about a very small area where the US, over the course of the last 7 years, took over 400 strikes. And when I say strikes, I don't mean one missile. Each strike can have up to 4 munitions releases. Okay, we're talking at one point at the height of the drone war in 2010, 2011, where you had missiles being dropped once every 3 days on the population. The rest of the time, the drones were overhead doing exactly what Paul talked about, which was ISR. And the problem with that is for the population below, they didn't know when they were doing ISR and when they were launching missiles. So you had constant terror on the ground as to whether the drone hovering and buzzing overhead was going to fire that day, the next day, whether it was going to fire at the market when you went to get your groceries, whether it was going to fire on your neighbor, who it was going to fire on. And you had a lot of deaths. One of my clients was a 14-year-old boy who survived a strike with a lot of injuries, but his entire family was killed. It was Obama's first strike. Books have come out saying that Obama was told immediately he'd killed civilians. To this date, we haven't been able to get even an acknowledgement out of the US government that they took the strike, much less that they killed Fahim's family and injured him. Now, that is part and parcel of what we're calling drone warfare, which is, for some reason, and we can have lots of debates why, this technology has enabled countries to launch strikes in areas where they otherwise would not launch strikes, and to do so in a completely and wholly unaccountable way, where they don't need to acknowledge it, they don't need to be transparent on what they're doing. They basically don't need to tell you anything. And for that kind of, that shift in security policy, which we've seen replicated in Yemen, in Somalia, and elsewhere, it's a significant shift because we've now somehow got ourselves with this new technology into a state of not war, but not peace. For the people on the ground, this is war. Let's make no mistake about it. For my clients living in Pakistan, the US has gone to war with them. From the US perspective, they're not at war in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, in any of these places. And so there's absolutely no democratic accountability at the other end of the spectrum either.
Thanks, Jen. So looking at the transfer of this kind of technology from the military battlefield to the domestic sphere, when looking at drones used for policing. Matthew, do you have any comments on where the drones use fits?
Well, even before, I guess, getting to the municipal police issue, I think that it's important to note, Paul touched on, that this is a new technology, but at the same time, right now we're seeing it kind of in the constructs of existing rules of war, more or less, that's being used as, I don't know, it's a little more stealthy, there's not as much retaliation on the UN level, but at the same time, it's still a tool of global hegemonic powers. And I think it's important to note that the US and Israel and countries that kind of oftentimes in the international scene are outside, the same rules don't apply to these countries as other countries, but we are rapidly seeing drone development in China and Russia, and so I think it's also, as far as kind of the bigger global security issue, right now we're kind of feeling comfortable with it because it's governments that maybe there's not transparency, but that we're used to these sort of actions. But one of my concerns is that the arms race is going to be developing in drones is not going to be secluded to places far away, rural Pakistan, that this could be increasingly a new vector for warfare, and right now it's somewhat contained to a few states, but there's rapidly developing technologies going on all across the globe. Then when we scale that down, I mean, on the commercialization side, it's not something we're focusing on today, but there are incentives inside of, from both the economic side and also the military side, having, not having a pilot in an aircraft to be able to do some of the things that used to only be able to be done with conventional aircrafts. But we are, as the video we saw, now police departments, especially in the US, are using drones for surveillance, and it's not just surveillance. We have to remember that this is part of a larger panopticon, the street-level surveillance, predictive policing, and so I think that it's one thing to say, oh, the poor civilians in Pakistan, but this is a technology that's rapidly coming to our doorsteps.
Okay. Is there anything either Paul or Jen you would like to add to that?
Well, coming from Britain, which has the distinction, if it is a distinction, of being the most surveilled country in the world with CCTV on every street corner because we had a long campaign with the IRA, the additional difference of having drones in the sky seems, from a UK point of view, not so great. Shooting from the sky in a domestic situation is to cross the symbolic boundary that I think that British police and in general European police and politicians wouldn't easily accept. And I also think, especially having been to all the fascinatingly paranoid sessions here about data insecurity and spook sociology, we shouldn't forget that at the moment, if the concern is about governments and surveillance, there is an enormous amount of data that governments are sucking in every day, and the problem is there's too much of it, the problem from a kind of spook perspective. So the amount of difference that an additional eye in the sky makes when added to cameras on the ground or secret policemen with long zoom lenses shooting from cars, it seems to me something we shouldn't exaggerate.
So what is the use of bringing in drones? Why are they coming in if that you think that wouldn't make much difference?
Well, my impression is they're not, in most countries, being used a great deal for domestic policing in a way that there are helicopters. Police have helicopters. They do traffic surveys. There are, and they follow up shootouts and people in fleeing cars. And that already happens with helicopters. To some extent, I think drones are beginning to replace some of that, although drones are fragile, they break. The various police services in the UK have broken them rather often, and they don't transform the situation. They may slightly improve police capabilities in some situations.
I would, because my counter to that is one of the things that I think that drones give police departments the capacity of is this kind of monitoring and the passive monitoring of things. And why I'm quite concerned of this is if you are in an area, and I think when we see a lot of these of drones being introduced, whether it's in refugee camps or inside of communities that are already maligned, that this eye in the sky allows also a playback. And I think that right now, CCTV cameras allow this as well, but they're not always so effective. But I am quite concerned that as these technologies get cheaper, and I mean, a helicopter still requires refueling, and it still requires at least one pilot and maybe even someone on surveillance. But the cost of one helicopter, if you can buy 15 drones and have these circling around the city for security, and especially in response to a terrorist attack or something, then we're now giving states or sub-state actors like police departments the ability to be able to recall what happened before an event. I mean, it's kind of the Minority Report in reverse, where I can now see what happened before an event, and I don't see a lot of disincentive for police departments or states to not have these sort of new surveillance tools, because they'll sell it to the public of this will allow us to fight crime better or to be able to identify the suspects in a case. And so if they have the price of one helicopter, can have 15 drones, do you see a disincentive? Why wouldn't they have this?
Two things. You're right. That started in Afghanistan to try and identify if an explosive mine blew up, who had laid it. Play back the video, although this was almost never possible because it is so bit intensive. But that was the intention. If that would happen with a bank robbery, why would that be a bad thing to be able to trace back where people came from?
Do you want to go? I mean, I think the challenge here is part and parcel of a broader challenge, which is that governments have started to think that data and visual surveillance somehow gives them a substitute for understanding the human dynamics of what's going on. And I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things Paul and I have discussed is, if a murder occurs, would you not want to rewind the tape and see who committed the murder to make sure that you're actually charging the right person? I don't think there's anyone here who would want to say that, or wouldn't want to do that. I think the danger and what we see constantly with governments, with new technologies and elements like this, is that it's a slippery slope between just using it to catch the murderer and then taking another step and maybe trying to predict when the murderer is going to hit, to trying to figure out who might be a murderer. And before you know it, you suddenly started charging people with crimes that they've not even committed. You've started punishing, and we're already seeing this in the context of the war on terror, punishing thought versus action. You're starting to charge people for even having the thought rather than actually committing the crime. And that's the risk the drones pose. In a foreign context, outside of a domestic context, we've seen this happening. We've seen the so-called drone wars use patterns of behavior from the sky to try to then take out militants. The result from the CIA's own records, which a journalist got a hold of in 2013, is that more than half the time they didn't know who they were killing. They couldn't even say they were killing Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. They just had to label people militants because they didn't know who they were killing. On-the-ground investigations were consistently showing those were civilians and people who weren't militants, okay? So you have this kind of, the famous New York Times quote from a CIA agent, when Leon Panetta saw 3 men in a field doing jumping jacks, he thought it was a terrorist training camp. These are real problems, and it's something that, while persistent surveillance can give you a sense from the eye in the sky that you actually understand what's going on, you don't understand what's going on because you don't know, you can't hear the conversations, you don't know who the people are, you don't understand the local customs. My favorite is we worked on an investigation of a wedding party hit in Yemen. It is one of the only strikes where the US leaked they were going to conduct an investigation. They leaked it anonymously. 3 weeks later, they anonymously leaked the results of that investigation and found that all 13 people killed in the wedding party were militants because they had guns. In Yemen, they were going to a wedding. Of course they had guns. Everyone on the ground was flabbergasted by the response. I would also argue if you're in Texas, that means half of Texas is now a target. But there's a reality here in that if you don't understand the culture, you don't have the human dimension, the eye in the sky tells you absolutely nothing.
And and I guess also to kind of push back a bit, at least in the American context, I guess on a constitutional level, I have 3 concerns. One, it's the chilling effect argument of the First Amendment, that the freedom of expression and assembly. If we start looking at places in which the people are assembling, then there can be a chilling effect of free expression. Particularly, I think that unlawful search and seizure, what constitutes search in the age of an omnipresent drone in the sky? And third, if I am in a place and there's drone footage of me and other data points point to me, could I be prosecuted could my presence in a particular place be seen as an admission of guilt? And so I think there's also I think that kind of the Fifth Amendment of saying that I don't have to testify against myself, and I think that by having an eye in the sky with playback, that inferences could be made in combination with other data, in which that there could be potential issues about even my presence in a place from a drone without context, inferring guilt.
Well, we seem to be saying that what really matters is what happens to the data feed, who has control of it, and in all of these information matters, what kind of fusion there is. Now, that seems to be a matter of constitutional control, of legal and political decisions. It is quite possible to imagine that you could have special restrictions on data feeds coming down from hovering drones. Local politicians could stand on a platform of having that kind of control. States can have, and I think there will be very different positions between states, but it's perfectly possible to say, we take a very restrictive view on this in one country, but others feeling, for cultural or historical reasons of greater threats, will move in another perspective. If you're voicing concerns about the US, well, I understand that, but it's not necessarily so strongly felt in other countries, in other situations.
At that point, I'm just going to move on to the next question, just so we stick to time. It actually moves pretty smoothly, because now we should look at what that real impact of using drones in military and policing is. Let me just get it to the... No. So, what impact do military and policing drones have? As sort of another visual cue or stimulus, as you will, we have a really short clip of an interview of someone in Pakistan who is a survivor.
अभी तो आपको पता है कि हम डिस्प्लेस हुए हैं, वज़ीरिस्तान से निकल चुके हैं, हम ज़रब-ए-अज़ब शुरू है वहाँ पे, अभी तो हम कुछ भी नहीं सुन रहे हैं, लेकिन बहरहाल उस वक़्त जब हमारे ऊपर ये उड़ रहे होते थे, बैठ रहा हो, और वहाँ पे एक मक्खी अंदर आ जाए और वो बीन शुरू कर दे, तो वो भी इंसान को डिस्टर्ब कर देता है। इसी तरह हमारे यानी ज़िंदगी भी इससे मुतासिर हुई है। इससे लोगों में अमेरिका के ख़िलाफ़ बहुत ही नफ़रत है, यानी अब सिर्फ अमेरिका फ़ौज के ख़िलाफ़ नहीं या अमेरिकी हुकूमत के ख़िलाफ़ नहीं, बल्कि अमेरिकियों के ख़िलाफ़ लोगों के वो जज्बात यानी इख्तिलाफात और इनसे नफ़रत वो बढ़ गई इलाके में।
So, when looking at the impact, we've already touched upon the sort of psychological impact there, but do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, Kareem's quite vocal in what he thinks is happening in North Waziristan. Kareem is one of my clients. He's actually in a lawsuit right now in Pakistan against the CIA for murder of his son and his 18-year-old son and his brother. New Year's Eve, 2009. Here's the reality of kind of living under drones in these places, which is we don't tell them who's on our kill list. We don't tell them who we're targeting. And because of things like signature strikes, where you're targeting based on patterns of behavior, they also can't figure it out. Just like I don't know what all of my neighbors are doing, they don't know what all of their neighbors are doing. So very basic activities, like talking to someone in the market or going to your neighbor's house, suddenly take on a life and death dimension because you can hear and see the drone overhead, and nobody's told you who it's aiming at. And I remember at one point a US official telling me, oh, but they haven't struck in 6 months, so this is just silly. Nobody told them we weren't going to strike for 6 months. So there's a problem there in saying they're not afraid of the drones just because we haven't struck. The other thing I would say is, look, what Kareem's getting at when he's talking about the anger is this has been a highly counterproductive program. So whether you want to buy the legal arguments or the ethical and moral arguments about whether we should be running hit lists around the world with these things, in places like Pakistan and Yemen, because we've killed so many of the wrong people, you're generating huge amounts of anger. And the best case I can give you of the counterproductive nature of the program is one of my clients, Faisal bin Ali Jabbar, is an engineer in Yemen. His brother-in-law was an imam who on a Friday preached against al-Qaeda in his community and on a Tuesday was killed in a drone strike. The impact it had on his community was immense. And the reason we think he got killed is because his sermon angered 3 local youth. Nobody knows who they are. They showed up in the community and wanted to meet with him. He took a local policeman with him because he wasn't worried about the drone overhead at that point. He was worried about the 3 men he was meeting with. As soon as they stepped out of the mosque, a drone struck and killed all 5 of them. The impact on the community was that the youth then thought, okay, well, if the US is going to assume I'm al-Qaeda, I might as well be al-Qaeda, because they don't seem to be distinguishing who's who. And I think those are really important things for us to grapple with in terms of what it looks like from the other end.
Matthew or Paul, is there anything you'd like to respond to in terms of that?
Yeah, I understand why the conversation keeps coming back to American drones in Waziristan and Yemen, but that isn't the whole story. Combat drones have been used in hot theaters where there is a UN-recognized state of internal war, like Afghanistan, and they're being used in Iraq and Syria now against Islamic State, in just the same way as manned aircraft, with just the same kind of military and legal justification. So, and that's actually the majority of the use that is happening with combat drones in the world today. I mean, the Americans haven't struck Pakistan for a month or two, I noticed. So, but meanwhile, the campaign is hotting up against the Islamic State. So that is the major statistical reality of drone use in the world today. And if you don't like it, if you don't like that part of it, then I can understand that, but then you have to be against manned air power, and then you have to be against Western troops, and you even have to be against Iraqi troops who are fighting Islamic State, and with Kurdish assistance, you would have to say, well, they are not entitled to get air support from drones. And that takes you into very strange territories. If you say this weapon is so uniquely demonic that it can't be used anywhere, then that's hard to fit in with any concept of armed conflict, I think. So we shouldn't forget that you can have never tasteful, but at least legal and sensible drone combat use, and that is the majority of the story at the moment.
So bringing it back to the impact on civilians, do you have either of you have any response?
I just want to parse the logical path that you laid out. I think two ways. One, and getting away from Waziristan and U.S., kind of this U.S. imperialism that we're almost talking about, and U.S. as a special case. But let's talk about the scalability of drones and what it means on a global theater. Russia is now building drone flights. I mean, even some of the weapons technology is even past drones, gliders and whatnot, being able to have global strike vehicles. But I think if we're talking about a unified system of global drone use, then, I don't know, A, I guess, is it possible, if you think it's possible, but B, what does it mean to be human, then, at the end of the day? What rights do I have as an individual in a time in which that, in one place of the world, drones are delivering packages, but also sucking up data, and another place that they're raining down fire from the sky? This is a new technology, but I do think because it has commercial applications, that we have to see it not just as a substitute for fixed-wing aircraft, but start thinking about it in a way that the amount of identifiable data that can be learned and ascertained about me and put into fusion centers, as well as what it means for the chain of command, as well as in war theaters. I think maybe such thing as a global treaty on drones is not possible. But what would you say then are the guiding principles of
minimization of harm? I think, and recognition of the reality, which is there is no global system for controlling the spread of drone technology. There's no treaty in prospect. There's no set of export controls which can guarantee it. Like lots of things in the high-tech area, it's fast, cheap, and out of control. And anything which doesn't come to grips with that reality. And part of the reality is that terrorist and non-state actor groups are going to start using drones back. I mean, it was always clear that they would, and there have been abortive attempts, but they will do it, and it'll be partly as a kind of hostile, mimetic, look, we're doing this because you could do it to us, and that'll be hyped up. That's inevitable. We have to just not splutter. And your question, what does it mean to be a human being, is not spluttering. It's a very serious question. But actually, what it means to be a human being is that you are exposed to a lot of unpleasant things. That's humanity in the 21st century, as it always has been. And unless one can see realistic ways of reducing that, protesting the human condition doesn't get us very far.
But I think, and just one last thing, and it's not really on topic, but there is a lot of research going into autonomous weapon platforms, and different governments, defense ministries have signaled that they are also interested in letting machines make decisions. And so what we're talking about now is dumb aircraft, essentially, that are mirroring fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters as well. But we are now at the beginning of an epoch in which that machines may very soon in some countries have the capacity to make a decision on who lives and who does not live.
Yeah, and that's a scary and a largely bad thing, and most Western governments are decisively against that. It isn't clear what the Russian position or the Chinese or other people's position is, and you know, I note Jennifer's skepticism. Even Western governments can't prove that they're not working on something in some black laboratory. And this is, you know, in terms of arms control, which I spent years doing, this is a nightmare. How do you verify this? If you had a set of declarations, or even if you had a treaty, how would you know that somebody else wasn't doing AI experiments in a lab somewhere?
And when you speak about harm to civilians, what does that really mean? You know, there is obviously the death toll, but as well as that, what are the things that we're trying to reduce when you talk about global standards, if there were to be one?
Well, I think some part of this is maintaining reasonable respect for international law, which would be Jennifer's point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, I think Paul's absolutely right in that in certain contexts, in declared war zones like Afghanistan and like Iraq, you have drones being used in much the same way that manned aircraft would be. They're providing protection for troops on the ground. They're providing strike capabilities in active, hot battlefields. I think the problem with the technology, and I'm not sure if it's I'm really not sure if it's a problem with our politicians or the technology, because I agree with you on one level, the technology in those zones being used by and large complies with international law. The problem is that the temptation to use them outside of those bounds appears to be too great for the politicians to resist. And so while we can say right now it's just Israel and the US, and I would halfway add the UK in there, and then we can leave it to the side, because I know Paul and I disagree, but when you've got the Prime Minister standing up in September and saying a new departure for us, we're going to take a strike in an area where Parliament told us we did not have authority to strike in a targeted kill type fashion, that is the US carbon copy model, especially when you follow it up with, we don't have to tell you anything, and we're not going to tell you anything, Parliament or the public. But aside from that, there seems to be this kind of temptation to use it, and the reality is the US, like it or not, sets precedents. It sets the rules for how we play the game. And right now, it's been playing the game in an extremely dangerous fashion for 7 years, while Europe sat quietly by and didn't criticize it. Either because it wanted to use them, or because it didn't know how to criticize them, or because it didn't know what to do. And so we've got a real danger here now as China comes online with these things, and Pakistan's now used it, and Iran tries to develop it, that you're suddenly going to have a whole bunch of countries who we would in no conceivable way want them to use them in the way that the US is using them, suddenly saying, oh, look, you know, just across the border, those South China Seas, I think I'm just going to take out that Japanese ship because there might be a terrorist on there. Or Iran taking a strike in Saudi because there's a terrorist there. I mean, the lack of transparency and accountability has created precedents and rules that should terrify everyone, including the US.
And I think the question, the phrasing of global security, and just to disassociate this from just military, because I think the thing is now with the refugee migrant crisis, you know, in Europe that makes headlines, again, I think what we're going to see is drones used for surveillance and perhaps even targeting, but even from a surveillance perspective on the most vulnerable communities. And this is going to rise in refugee camps, and where it's more convenient or cheaper to have a drone overhead than having guards walking through tents. But it's not just this technology, it's also combined with facial recognition, with other ways to track people. I mean, the Bay Area in San Francisco, if you look at a heat map of where police license plate readers are, or where MC catchers are being used to simulate cell towers and hijack people's phones, this is in places, it's not Mountain View. It's places in which there are vulnerable communities, and in global security, when it comes to the flow of people, and to your point, there are bad people out there, but to what degree are we going to let the scary would-be terrorists dictate an entire global policy that could affect, or it was going to primarily and upon inception affect those who don't have a voice, don't have legal recourse, and don't have anyone standing up for them. And that's my concern, that there's always going to be bad people out there. But if we're not seeing this in the context of the slippery slope, and that who's actually going to be a victim of these drones, and not just maybe not a missile from the sky, but a constant surveillance living inside a panopticon, this is to me one of the human costs of drones.
Well then, if your point, and I understand the passion behind that, is that states can misuse a whole nexus of high technology options, aerial or cybernetic. That's all true. We can all sense bad ways that technology can go. But then the important thing is not to get hypnotized on one particular type, but to look at the control arrangements in the political system and the legal system. Conversations we haven't even really begun to start in Europe or very much in the US yet. What is the way in which we want electronic privacy and visual privacy handled? What rights does one have to one's body in the way it's viewed and showed up on screens? And incidentally, it's not, of course, just governments. It's big companies who will be operating cars with cameras which will record a great deal of data, and will fly delivery systems. Again, they'll record data. So it's big companies and governments and small hobbyists and nutcases and perverts. Well, what do we think about that whole range of visual possibilities? And to talk about the droning of Waziristan, which I agree is legally problematic and horrible. We could talk further about its overall strategic impact, which is a complicated matter in itself. But it misses the point of this bigger thing we're all going to have to live with on our streets and in the immediate airspace above our houses.
I think that segues quite neatly into our last question, which is what next? I think as we have not very much time left, if each of you have maybe a couple of minutes to sort of summarize what you think is the future and what could be a solution. What are the first steps or the red lines in going forward? And then we can have some questions.
I can start unless you
would you like to start?
Go for it.
So the four of us met yesterday, and I don't know. To me, the word that I'd like to introduce, to drop on y'all right now, is the idea of a drones budsman. This would be an ombudsman for drones, and I think, as Paul pointed out, that this fusion of data coming from so many different sources is really at the heart of it. It really comes down to what does privacy mean in this panopticon that's not just it's not just keystrokes, but there's also now eyes in the sky. And so I think that one practical thing would be for corporations, governments, and police departments to be able to have an outline of what handles or who has access to this data, where does it go, and who's able to access it. And if we're talking about things like machine learning, what are actually the weighted properties of these databases that are learning? Is it, if there's a drone driving around a black neighborhood and that's all it sees, is the machine learning going to start suspecting a particular type of person because of the way where they live or what they look like? And so one of the recommendations that I would have would be some sort of civilian oversight from municipal police departments, that data is stored outside of traditional fusion centers, and that this drone data needs to, because there's privacy implications, needs to have an additional level of oversight. And so I would just say that the other thing is, I think we need a larger conversation about what is the exceptional and a reasonable expectation of privacy in the day of drones. to me, this really gets to the heart of the matter because it's only one part of a larger rubric of a surveillance state. And so what then does this eye in the sky bring on top of the existing surveillance technologies that already exist, that already know more about us? And it's not just from the government, but Google drones and other things. And so what does it mean? I go back to my humanistic question of what does it mean to be human, but what does it mean to have human privacy when I not only have a digital identity, but now my physical identity from the sky, there's this visual aspect, is now incorporated into the meta picture of me that's going to be the basis of decisions, whether to kill me or my credit score or whatever it may be. And so I would say that one, civilian oversight for data collected by drones, and be a larger conversation around what does privacy mean in the age of drones.
Paul,
I'd agree with both of those. And there are analogies here, I think, to sort of cyber information. You need trusted, reliable information commissioners with an oversight role to see what's being collected and why and how it can be justified and when it can be destroyed. But I think also there's a role for enforcement that just isn't happening. I mean, in the UK, and I think in the rest of Europe, there are laws about not flying drones over airports, for example, or buildings, but they don't get enforced. Then there's no registration system, the police don't follow up. So at some point, if we want to mitigate the bad effects that drones can have, we've got to get serious about thinking about tracing people, finding them, arresting them, if necessary, imprisoning them, but certainly fining them for wild, reckless, or greedy drone use. So we're going to have to think about paparazzi and the absolute right to journalistic exposure. And I think we're going to have to face the fact there are very different national attitudes to this. The Brits don't seem to worry about being photographed. They absolutely resent having to carry documentation around. There are levels of trust or distrust in the state which will not be the same in each country. There are cultural attitudes towards robots. Some cultures find them very disturbing and chilling. The Japanese, for example, quite like robots. So you would expect rather different solutions in different countries. But we need to think about those trade-offs. But to take a pessimistic view, it may be part of the price of living in a high-technology 21st century city that you give up some of those rights to anonymity. That's just how the system has to work. Now, where the trade point is reached, I don't know, but that's the discussion we need to have.
But it doesn't. It's this security versus privacy. It's a false dichotomy.
It's not just about security, I think. It's just about
about futurism, about technology.
Yeah.
We for thousands of years we've lived and to say just because we have technology doesn't mean that we have to usurp our right as human beings to an existing or to an emerging technology.
Not completely. Yeah.
Before we carry on, Jen, is there anything you'd like to say before we move on to questions? This debate is great.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. I think it's great from the domestic perspective. I'm going to do what Paul doesn't want me to do and go back to the international perspective, mainly because that's what I do day in and day out, is try to prevent my clients from getting killed by them. But here's the reality on the international front in terms of how they're being used outside of war zones, which is it's not just the US. It might be the US pressing the button, but we know the UK's helping with the find and fix. We know that Germany has a base right here at Ramstein that without which the drones don't fly. It is a relay station that enables the strikes in Yemen. You take down Ramstein. The drones don't fly in Yemen because of the curve of the earth. We're involved, Faisal, on behalf of Faisal, in litigation right now against the German state. The courts and the public and the politicians need to step up and start doing what they need to do, which is checking government power and making sure that if governments are going to run around launching missiles in places where we're not formally at war, that they're being transparent and accountable about it so that there is that check, so that people aren't mistakenly getting killed, and so that, quite honestly, this war on terror that seems to be perpetual and endless starts to get somewhere, which is back to a place of normality where we're not just running off killing everyone.
Okay, I think we should move on to questions now because we only have a little bit of time left. Okay.
Anybody who has questions, please come to me or my colleague over there.
Okay, so if we have this lady here.
Hello. Jillian York. My question is primarily for Paul, but I'd be curious for everyone on the panel. Look, I'm as excited about pizza and burrito delivery drones as everybody. I love drone photos. But I thought I heard you say that regardless of what's happening in Waziristan, that there are ethical uses for murder drones. And I'm really wondering what those ethical uses for killer drones are. I've been racking my brain and I just don't see it.
Well, killer drones are combat aircraft. And so in Afghanistan, Western aircraft are flying in a war, sanctioned by the United Nations, trying to drop things as precisely as possible. And drones can be more precise because they go slower and lower than fast-moving fighter jets. So if you regard any use of air power as ethical, there is no reason why drones can't be used as ethically as any other armed aircraft. I don't understand why you would think that there's something special about that. And all the evidence from Afghanistan seems to be that the locals don't regard use there as very different from bombs or rockets. Whether it's a drone or an aircraft or an artillery piece 20 miles away doesn't really resonate with the people concerned. Their question is, does it hit civilians or not?
Jen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is I think it depends on where you're at in Afghanistan. I think it depends on the prevalence of the drones there. There have been reports of people saying that the drones constantly in the sky are driving them nuts out of Afghanistan as well as Pakistan. The other thing you have going on in Afghanistan right now, which there's not time to go into, is all of the Western powers technically declared the war over in December 2014. In the past year, we've dropped 500 drone strikes on Afghanistan. And in fact, drones are very quickly replacing manned aircraft in the Afghan theater because it allows us to withdraw from the war while not actually withdrawing from the war. And I think that's a real problem, again, when you're looking at accountability domestically.
Can I mention there's a Pakistani man called, a very brave physics professor called Pervez Hoodboy, who wrote this article called Our Drones and Theirs. And his point is that if you're in Pakistan as a kind of secular liberal person, you are at war with people who are sending human drones at you with suicide pacts. And what you need in that war is pretty much everything. You need political reform, you need ideological contestation, but you need sometimes just to kill these people before they can be organized to send out more and more people at you. And I noticed in...
Wait, okay. If I did interrupt, wait, I think
he is a Pakistani.
But it sounded like you believe this. This is, again, this pre-crime, right? That where we're saying that intent to do something is equating to action.
Arming and taping up suicide bombers is being absolutely engaged in a crime.
It's
loading,
but it's not the same as murder. It's not to say that just because somebody has this, that they're not going to turn away at the last instant and say, you know what, maybe I want to live. And so this is a problem, I think, with the idea of a defense establishment saying, no, that this person, because they've taken this one action, we're logically drawing the line until assumed guilt.
So you think it's okay to let them go into a marketplace and detonate themselves and kill 30 people?
I think that we have due process of law for a reason.
No, you don't in Pakistan.
But wait, there's two things going on here. One, I'm sick of the ticking time bomb scenario because the drone strikes aren't happening in the ticking time bomb scenario. There's no evidence that any of the strikes in Pakistan were people putting on suicide vests and about to walk out the door. It's Hollywood fiction, it's Defense Department fiction. They're being targeted way before that point, and the vast majority were being targeted based on patterns of behavior. We can't even say who they were or what their intentions were. The second thing is when you're looking at the link between domestic, there is no doubt the person who has suffered the most from the war on terror is the Pakistani population. It's not the Americans, it's not Europe, it's the Pakistani population themselves. They've also suffered from their own government's policies and a whole bunch of other stuff that we won't go into right now. But the reality is when you look at, there's an academic at the University of Bath who tried to correlate terrorist attacks inside Pakistan to drone strikes, and there was a correlation. They were experiencing, there was. Okay,
it's a very disputed area of study.
It's a disputed study, okay, but there is some evidence to suggest that when there were drone strikes, the retaliation was to go into a market and blow yourself up because you can't blow the drone up. If you're looking at this as this is the fundamental kind of, this is what you get with asymmetrical warfare. If I can't attack the drone, which is what I think I'm at war with, my only option,
It's
as far
about-
as some think,
it's
and,
about
you know,
my own
and I'm not,
people.
look, I will be first to condemn all of the terrorism that's going on there, okay? I know it's caused massive problems and massive loss of life, but their response is to go blow themselves up in a marketplace.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So we have a couple more questions. That was a very long question. Anybody else? Yep.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting discussion. I was wondering a little bit, because we talked a lot about the drone strikes and less about the surveillance by drones, and I see how this is a really big problem, but for me, the surveillance is also a really big problem. So I was kind of surprised to see that we're only talking about the strike part. In Germany, we have a constitutional right not to be infringed in our privacy. So we have the right not to be a person of interest the whole time, every day when we go about our daily business. And you said before that life is always also sometimes unpleasant, and that we have to open a new discussion about how we want privacy to look like. But we have a lot of answers to this question, not all of them, but we have a lot of them. And a lot of the answers are in our constitution. We've set the rules 100 years ago. So why don't we look to these rules, to those principles, and apply them now and say, no, just because there's a new technology doesn't mean the government can survey me all the time. Why don't we do that?
Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I'm not sure you're going to get much disagreement. I think the problem is, and I can't speak for the German context because I'm not a German lawyer. What I can say in the UK and the US context is the technology has gotten ahead of the law. So the laws don't necessarily rein in the technology in the way we would want, and the policymakers, as tends to happen with technology, are so far behind the curve that they're also not legislating to rein in the technology. I think that's coming. I think the part of the way that's coming is through the court systems. I think the other way that's coming is through things like the Snowden leaks. I think there will be legislative change, but I think some of the rules are slow in coming in part because they weren't equipped to deal with this. They were designed for, you know, a helicopter in the sky that flies for 20 minutes once every week, rather than a drone that's going to persistently be there picking up everything for weeks on end.
And I agree that every solution is going to come out in terms of national political choices. It may be there is an extremely strong commitment to privacy in Germany, which will lead to a different system of laws and regulations. But how that will play out against technical realities and also economic realities, because some of these technologies are actually extremely profitable, and companies are not going to want to lose out by excessive state restriction. So how that will settle down in Germany, I mean, no non-German can say. And I doubt it's possible to predict even if you are a German lawyer.
I would just say that one of my concerns is the idea of like a national security letter in the US context, in which a lot of this is being done behind the veil of national security or the intelligence agencies, and so they play by a different game. I mean, even the BND, like, there was a scandal, oh, I can't believe the NSA was hacking us, and then it came out that, oh, well, there was massive data collection as well that they hadn't admitted to. So I think that from one, that the intelligence services don't play by the same rules as everyone else. And secondly, what we've seen in the US now with the militarization of municipal police departments, a lot of this is done by Department of Homeland Security grants that are basically offloading budget of military equipment that now finds its way on the streets of cities across America. And so I'm worried about that. So it's two. One, that like the intelligence agencies are operating on a different legal, extra legal framework. And secondly, under the guise of national security. And secondly, that the normalization of these technologies find its way into our city streets before the time that policymakers have a chance to protect us.
I think every single question is going to launch a whole new debate, a whole new chapter in this session today. So I think we have to wrap it up. But thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our brilliant speakers. I think what we've realized today is that the key thing is to open debate, have these conversations. They're difficult. And to get those red lines of what we need to move forward. Transparency is key. Accountability is key, because we need some form of checks and power on these decisions that are being made by people who feel, they might not need to consult because it is an immediate, urgent threat. These are decisions that require quite a lot of expertise. But I think if we try and democratize that by having these conversations so that more people know more about it, that is the first way forward. All right. Thank you.